Get going. Let's jump into it. So welcome to the Pedestrian and Bicycle Level of Traffic Stress webinar hosted by the Center for Pedestrian and Bicycle Safety. My name is Nick Frenchak, and I'm the director of CPBS and also a professor in the Civil Engineering Department at the University of New Mexico. So what we hope to accomplish today is I'll first give a very brief introduction to our center. And then I'll talk about our bicycle level of traffic stress project, which is ongoing. So it'll be a fairly high level overview of kind of what the goals of the project are. And specifically what we're doing with that project is we're updating the criteria for intersection or crossing level of traffic stress. Then we have Bob Schneider from University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, who will be going in depth into the pedestrian level of traffic stress tool. This is a new tool. It's published. It's out in the world. So he's going to be doing a deep dive into that. And then we should have time for Q&A at the end. If you do have any questions throughout the webinar, you should have a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please click on that and put your questions in there, and we should be able to see them. And we'll answer those at the end. So a little bit more about the Center for Pedestrian and Bicyclist Safety. So we are a university transportation center funded by the U.S. Department of Transportation. It's a 5-year center. We're about a year and a half in, so we should be around for another 4 years. Hopefully we'll get renewed for the next round as well. We are a consortium of 5 universities led out of UNM, and we've also got San Diego State, Berkeley, University of Tennessee, and University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee on the team. We're doing lots of research. So we just wrapped up our year 1 projects, about 22 projects. We've got another 20 to 22 ongoing right now. So if you're interested in that research, please go to our website. You can read about all the projects. We've also got our webinar series. We've got a monthly newsletter, and we're trying a couple times a week to post a link LinkedIn with what we're doing around the consortium. So definitely go to the website and engage with our center through those mediums. Okay, so to jump into the bicycle level of traffic stress project, the original LTS, I'm not sure where everybody is. I imagine some people have used it already. Some people are interested but have not used it yet. So just kind of going back to the beginning, the original LTS was published by Mercuria, Firth, and Nixon in 2012 in a report for the Mineta Transportation Institute. That original report actually had LTS criteria for both segments and intersections. But it was really the segment LTS that caught on, and it's been pretty widely adopted by agencies across the country. What we're doing with this current project is we're updating specifically the intersection criteria or the crossing criteria. So for the current project that we're working on, we've got Peter Firth on the team, also myself, and Chris Cherry from University of Tennessee from within our consortium, and Wes Marshall from the University of Colorado, Denver. So if you're familiar with LTS for segments, you're probably familiar with these tables. So this table is for bicyclists in mixed traffic. And for segments, it's relatively straightforward. You can see in this table that you need to know the number of lanes of the roadway that you're analyzing, ADT or vehicle volumes, vehicle speeds. And with those 3 variables, you can determine what the LTS of that segment is. Probably a little bit of an oversimplification, but I like this figure to kind of explain what LTS is really getting at. So LTS is on a scale of 1 to 4, 1 being the lowest stress facility that you can see on the right there. So that would be akin to a separated bike trail, separated from motor vehicle traffic. That would be the lowest stress, so it would probably be acceptable to the highest number of prospective bicyclists, including children, for example. The other end, LTS4, would be the highest stress facility. That would be like riding on a roadway in mixed traffic. That's probably going to be acceptable to the fewest number of prospective bicyclists. So again, as you can see in this figure, for a segment, relatively straightforward, number of lanes, vehicle volumes, vehicle speeds, and we can figure out that LTS. Intersections are a little bit more complicated. So really what we're trying to do with this intersection LTS is we're going to create criteria so that you can determine the LTS of every crossing but really we're trying to identify what we consider critical crossings. And that's going to be when a crossing is higher stress than the segment that it is on. So an extreme example of that would be this off-road trail in Albuquerque, New Mexico. You can see the trail on the right. It's completely separated from traffic. LTS 1, I'd be happy to let my kids ride on that. There's really no vehicular conflicts until you get to a crossing like this. Principal arterial, relatively high vehicle volumes, high vehicle speeds, 6 lanes. So that's going to be an LTS 3, 4. We're still trying to 100% nail down the exact criteria. But all to say that this is what we consider a critical crossing. So a low stress segment with a high stress barrier in the middle of it. That's really what we're trying to identify with this project. That was an extreme example, but there's plenty of examples on road as well. So with this example, you can see on the top, we've got a bike lane on a collector, relatively low volume, low speed. According to the tables, that would be an LTS 2 segment. But you can see that the bike lane drops off as we're approaching this intersection here. It's an intersection with a 6-lane arterial, high volumes, high speeds, left turn conflicts, right turn conflicts. So that would be, again, a higher LTS. That would be another example of a critical crossing that we're trying to identify with this project. So that's the overall goal of the project. We really see it as 2 different parts. So we have intersections are complex, right? There's lots of different variables that could introduce stress at an intersection. So we first want to identify all those possible variables. We want to talk about those variables. And that could be useful if a city is trying to run an LTS analysis of a single intersection. But also the other side of the project is that the beauty of LTS is that you can analyze an entire connected network. So if you're working on the citywide level, you might not have data on every single variable that is going to be pertinent. So we do want to think about all those variables that are important if you're looking at a single intersection, and then try to boil that down to understand what is most important, what are we realistically going to have data for, so that we can run an analysis of an entire network. So thinking first about all the important variables with an intersection. So really it's about conflicts with vehicles. So we've got left turn conflicts. Ideally, we would know the number of turning vehicles. We would understand signal phasing. Is this left turn protected? Is it permitted? We've got right turn conflicts of vehicles turning onto the roadway that the bicyclist is riding on. And in this picture, I'm assuming the bicyclist is moving straight across this intersection. So we again want to know number of turning vehicles here. Is right turn on red allowed or prohibited? Is there channelization for that right turn? Detection, probably not going to be an issue with this large intersection, but some smaller intersections, maybe the signal doesn't detect you. You would have to get off your bike, walk over and hit the pedestrian button. Of course, as always, vehicle volumes and vehicle speeds on the roadway. Some of the larger intersections, we might want to account for refuge. And then also the bike lane configuration. So does that bike lane drop off? Does it go to the intersection? Does it go through the intersection? And how are the right turning vehicles that are coming from behind you, how are those interacting with you in that bike lane? So a lot of different variables that we want to account for. Now we're trying to figure out what are the most pertinent variables? How can we boil that down so that a city can actually use this tool for an entire network analysis across their entire city. So I'll provide the framework. We don't have all the LTS values plugged in quite yet, but I'll provide the framework for kind of the direction that we're hoping to take this project. I'm imagining for the entire network analysis that we're starting off with, you have a GIS layer of your entire network, roads and trails. With that network, you can then identify all of your intersections, and we're going to break those intersections apart into 4 main categories. So if you've got an intersection of a trail intersecting with another trail, that's going to be LTS 1. You really shouldn't have any vehicular conflicts at that type of intersection. If you've got an intersection of a trail crossing a road, like you can see in the picture below, now we're really concerned with gaps in the vehicle stream. We hopefully should not have to be concerned about turning movements at one of these intersections. Hopefully no vehicles are turning onto the trail. But we're really just looking for gaps to cross this road. So we're going to be concerned first and foremost with traffic control. You can see with this crossing, there is no traffic control. There's a little bit of signage. But you could have a situation where you have yield, like an RRFB or some kind of flashing beacon. Or you could have full traffic control, maybe a pedestrian hybrid beacon at the trail crossing. So what kind of traffic control is there? What kind of refuge is there? And then the number of lanes for the roadway that you're crossing and the vehicle volume and speed. And this is one thing I'd love to get input from folks in the audience. Which variables are going to be most important for you all? Are any of them redundant? Which variables are cities regularly going to have data for? Specifically, I'm thinking about vehicle speed. At least in Albuquerque, you can assume that any 6-lane roads like this are going to be signed at 35 miles per hour. Any 4-lane roads are going to be signed at 30 miles per hour. And any smaller roads, 2-lane roads, are going to be signed at 25 miles per hour. So do we need to know the vehicle speeds in addition to the number of lanes? Can we just use number of lanes and functional classification? What would be the best combination of variables to use for a wide network-wide analysis? So those are the first 2 types of intersections. Then we've got road intersections, and we're going to break those apart into 2 different types. So first we've got on-signalized intersections. With the on-signalized intersections, I'm assuming that the movement is across the primary roadway, so that bicyclist is stopped at that stop sign. So once again, it's fundamentally the same as what we were looking at before, where we're looking for a gap in the traffic. This is a little more complicated because now you can have turning conflicts, but fundamentally it's a problem of gap acceptance. For the on-signalized intersections, we're really not concerned about bicyclists on that main arterial. If a bicyclist was riding on that main arterial, there is no bike lane, so it's LTS 4. You're not going to have any critical crossings on that roadway. If there was a bike lane on that arterial, the bicyclists would have right of way through this intersection if they were on the arterial. So really, we're just concerned on the secondary roadway crossing the main arterial. That's our main concern there. Signalized intersections, this one will then be different. So we're assuming that the bicyclist is going straight across the road here. They've got the green light, so they're not looking for a gap. Really, what we're concerned with here is turning conflicts. So now we're considering, what is the bike lane doing? Does it drop off? Does it go through the intersection? And once again, we're concerned with the number of lanes, not just of the road that you're crossing, but also the road that you're on, because that might be an indicator of the total number of turning conflicts. And then also the same question of vehicle volumes, vehicle speeds. So that's fundamentally what we're trying to accomplish with this project. That's the basic framework. To fill in that framework, we're hoping to get input for validation of the LTS values. So please keep an eye out for that. We're hoping to, once the framework is finalized, we'll get it out there into the world to get diverse viewpoints on the LTS values. And then we're hoping to have some preliminary results for this project in summer 2025. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll hand it over to Bob to talk about pedestrian level of traffic stress.
So much, Nick. Let me share my screen here with everybody. Bring it up. All right, so Nick gave a great overview of the concept of level of traffic stress. We at UW-Milwaukee, as a part of the Center for Pedestrian and Bicyclist Safety, are tackling pedestrian level of traffic stress. And I want to acknowledge my co-authors, and in particular, Sid Swift. She led this work as a master's student, developing the initial tables for pedestrian level of traffic stress. And Kyle Nelson also worked on a number of the case studies and refined the tables. So this is a collaborative effort that we did with my students and I. And now we're moving to the phase of putting it out in the world and seeing how well it works, and then going through some validation and refinement. So that's what I'll talk about today. As Nick was mentioning, level of traffic stress is a concept that really simplifies perceptions of traffic safety in the roadway environment. In this case, we're focused on pedestrians' perceptions. And there are methods that exist to evaluate pedestrian comfort in various ways, or pedestrian level of service in the highway capacity manual. But what we're really trying to do is simplify the many, many factors that could be involved in pedestrian perceptions of the traffic safety environment down to just a few, the most critical ones, and then assigning a level of traffic stress of 1 through 4, similar to the bicycle level of traffic stress for pedestrians. So I'll go through some of the origins, the variables that we use, then give a couple of examples how we've applied the PLTS, and then go through a few next steps that we're working on during this year of research. So Nick again gave a good overview of this. The BLTS was first adopted in 2012 as a part of the Minnesota Transportation Institute research. And it really took off from there. Simplified tables that we're working with. But at that time, there wasn't any similar method for pedestrian level of traffic stress. In the time since 2012 and between then and now, there have been some practice-based methods that have adopted table-based methods to assess pedestrian level of traffic stress. In particular, we looked at these three here from Oregon DOT, Washington State DOT, and Montgomery County, Maryland. They all took fairly similar approaches to summarizing a level of traffic stress. And so we drew upon their experiences and the methods that they established to try to create something that could be more uniform and applied throughout the country. These methods have actually been adopted in a couple of different ways as consultants have worked in various other communities and applied them. But there isn't necessarily a standard accepted practice for PLTS yet. And so that's what we're working on. So our method is rooted in those previous applications, but we also looked at the pedestrian suitability literature. In other words, what are the factors that academic studies have identified as being associated with pedestrian comfort or suitability, especially with respect to traffic risk. And so we had a number of research syntheses that we looked at and identified traffic characteristics, pathway conditions, land use and built environment characteristics, a number of other variables that have been identified in the literature. Some of the most common that we see in representing pedestrian level of traffic stress include some measure of the width of the roadway. How many lanes are there, for example? Some measures of traffic volume, and then presence of sidewalks and buffers. Those are some of the most common things that we see in the pedestrian suitability literature. Now, there are certainly dozens, if not hundreds, of other factors that influence how pedestrians feel when traveling along or across a street. And all those factors are important, but they aren't necessarily easy to collect or the best approach to create a practical tool. Some additional origins of our study go to pedestrian safety literature and practice. This example map shows pedestrian crash rates at intersections in the city of Milwaukee. This was done as a part of the city of Milwaukee's pedestrian plan in 2019. We had estimated pedestrian volumes at each of these intersections and then the number of crashes. So we were able to create crash rates. And these locations with high pedestrian crash rates tend to cluster along high traffic volume, higher speed, and multi-lane arterial streets. So those are some of the characteristics that you'll see when I get into the pedestrian level of traffic stress that are important for determining what stress level exists. Many of you are familiar with the concept of a high injury network. And so these locations are often along these multi-lane, high-speed, high-volume arterials. And our method of pedestrian level of traffic stress is likely to be able to identify some of these locations. We are interested in the future to map the locations of high PLTS as well as crashes, but that hasn't been done yet. But in theory, we think that a lot of the same variables expressing that relationship between roadway design and safety will likely be there. Pedestrian safety guidance also gives us some intuition about what to include in our pedestrian level of traffic stress. So this study from the Federal Highway Administration, it's the guide for improving pedestrian safety at uncontrolled crossing locations. And there's a number of types of treatments that can be used, reducing the number of lanes, having curb extensions, pedestrian refuge islands, various kinds of rapid flashing beacons, pedestrian hybrid beacons. These are facilities that have been noted to have a positive safety impact and is likely to reduce the stress of a crossing. And so these are some of the same types of treatments that we include in our tables for the pedestrian LTS. So very broadly, very similar to the bicyclist level of traffic stress, we have 4 categories where PLTS 1 is the least stress up to PLTS 4, which is the highest stress. The way that we express this here in this slide is if you're at PLTS 1, you don't need as much attention to traffic. Now, everybody should be aware when crossing a street, but you aren't going to feel like you need to be on edge when you're doing that crossing. Whereas PLTS 4, you're going to probably feel very stressed and need to pay a lot of attention to the cars going along the street, whether you're walking along or crossing that. We mentioned the concept of sort of special ability in PLTS 4. That gets to the idea that these are likely locations that people who have disabilities, people who are kids or have other challenges crossing the street are not going to feel comfortable crossing. Whereas PLTS 1, that should be comfortable for everybody. I said crossing in PLTS 4. It's either crossing or walking along the street. We have 2 different types of assessment. I mentioned them both already. One is the PLTS for walking along or traveling as a pedestrian along a roadway segment. And then there's a second one for crossing a roadway segment. So first, for traveling along roadway segments, we look at these 5 variables: traffic speed, motor vehicle volume, sidewalk width, paved shoulder width, and then the buffer between the motor vehicle travel lane and the pedestrian space. These factors have been around for a long time in terms of pedestrian suitability analysis. Many of these were accounted for in some of the original pedestrian level of service work that was done by Sprinkle Consulting for Florida DOT back in 2001. As you look at this list, the 5th one, the buffer width, has an asterisk beside it. And I wanted to note that because we are thinking about ways to make this tool useful at both the sort of neighborhood and corridor project specific level, and then at the full network level across the county or community, so you can assess an entire network. The variables that we have with asterisks are ones that many communities may not have on hand or may be fairly time expensive to collect. And so in future iterations of the network-based version, we may not include that one, but this is something that we're considering as we move forward. So getting into the tables to assess which of the traffic stress levels does your roadway segment fall into. Table 1 just shows if you have a segment with no sidewalk, traveling as a pedestrian in that area is going to be more comfortable if it's very low speed or very low traffic volume. If you don't have a shoulder to walk on, then really you only get level of traffic stress 2. If there is a shoulder and you have a very slow speed, you may feel very comfortable in level of traffic stress 1. But anything more than 25 miles an hour where there's no sidewalk, that is a PLTS 4. Looking over on the right side, we have roadway segment categories divided up by those critical variables of speed, sidewalk width, and buffer width. So as you see, as speeds increase along the roadway, that the traffic stress goes up. As the buffer distance becomes smaller, the traffic stress goes up. And then as you have narrower sidewalks, the traffic stress goes up. So we really want lower speed, wider sidewalks, more buffer to give the most comfortable, least stressful type of experience for pedestrians. The traffic volume here is important to note because we have 3 different tables, one for low traffic volume, one for moderate, and one for high traffic volumes. I'm just going to show the low traffic volume one here and then switch over to the high traffic volume. In this case, we made our split points at 2,500 ADT and 7,500 vehicles per day. So when we see the one with the higher traffic volumes, you can see there's much higher stress levels involved. Walking along that roadway with more cars going by is a more stressful experience. Then we have the roadway crossing variables. So the factors we consider there, very similar to walking along the roadway. First of all, traffic speed, number of lanes being crossed, presence of traffic signal, speed and lanes, first being similar to the walking along the roadway. But then we have 5 more factors that have to do with the crossing condition itself. So is there a traffic signal or pedestrian hybrid beacon? Is there a stop sign? Is there a refuge island, a median island, curb extensions? And then is there a high visibility crosswalk with rapid flashing beacon? The final 3 of those, we think, many communities won't have those on hand. So again, these are ones that could potentially be omitted when we think about a network-based approach, but that's something that we continue to work on. I want to just talk a little bit about the traffic speed variable. It's important in both the traveling along the roadway and crossing the roadway level of traffic stress. Most communities probably don't have 85th percentile speeds or some measure of actual traffic speed. So in our report, we write that you can use the posted speed as a proxy for the traffic speed in identifying which place on the table to look up the LTS. However, we know that traffic speed is incredibly important. And if you have a high level of speeding along a certain corridor in your community, it's even better if you could use an 85th percentile speed to represent that traffic speed category for the assessment of PLTS. It's just a matter of if you have the data available. So looking at the crossing tables, here's an example of a high traffic volume situation. This is for controlled roadway crossings. So these are locations with either traffic signals, stop signs, or a pedestrian hybrid beacon. As you increase the number of lanes being crossed, you have a higher level of traffic stress. And then certain combinations of additional crossing facilities lead you to having a higher or lower pedestrian level of traffic stress. If you can have median island and curb extensions, that in general reduces the stress for the crossing. But if you only have a refuge island or only have a curved extension, you'll have slightly higher levels of stress. When putting these tables together, we used our best judgment based on what we've seen from the literature as affecting people's comfort levels. However, whether one cell is a 2 or a 3 or is a 3 or a 4 should be looked at. And as we apply this and as others apply it around the country and experiment with this first iteration of pedestrian LTS, we'd love to get your feedback on, well, does this seem like it matches with what the pedestrian experience is? And if you have suggestions after you've used it for potentially shifting a number or two around, we'd love to hear about it because that's part of our qualitative follow-up in assessing potential revisions to this method. Then looking at uncontrolled roadway crossings, many of the similar concepts are here, but this would be if you have traffic control of a rapid flashing beacon, for example, or no traffic control. For example, just having a marked crosswalk, but no other crossing facilities. And so you can see in these cases, if you have the refuge island along with them, high visibility crossing marking, these each have an effect, but looking back to the other one, there's none of these except the very slowest speed and crossing width of only 1 or 2 lanes that get a PLTS 1. Uncontrolled roadway crossings are some of the least comfortable and most stressful experiences for pedestrians. And so you can see that reflected in this chart, especially as the traffic volumes and the number of traffic lanes increase. Another important piece of the approach that we have put forward is that any crossing that doesn't have accessible curb ramps automatically gets a 3 or 4. Crossings need to be accessible for everybody. And so that's a judgment that we decided to add into this tool. If you don't have an accessible way to get down the curb, you end up with people crossing in other locations that they can get down to the roadway surface, and that can lead to people being in the roadway and having a very stressful experience. I want to give a few examples of our applications of pedestrian level of traffic stress. Several of these are from Wisconsin. So Sydney Swift, when she first developed this tool, she did the PLTS for all street segments in Shorewood, Wisconsin, which is just north of Milwaukee, a city of about 14,000 people. And she identified the segments that have these different PLTS levels. There's no PLTS 4 in Shorewood, but several of them have PLTS 3. These are major arterial streets. And if you can see my pointer here, this is Wisconsin Highway 190, and it has 4 lanes. It does have a median island, but it's a 4-lane, very high volume arterial, more than 20,000 vehicles per day. There's 4-lane sections of Highway 32 over here, but they narrow back to 2 lanes when you get away from this Atwater Park area. And so you can see how the PLTS changes for the roadway segments in those locations. This is Oakland Avenue. It has very high traffic volumes along it as well, but they get lower as you go north along that corridor. So intuitively, it seems to reflect what the experience is in that community for walking along the roadway. For crossing roadways in Shorewood, Sydney zoomed in on sort of the heart of Shorewood's commercial areas and surrounding neighborhoods to show what the PLTS was for crossing. Now, she didn't do the entire city of 14,000 people because it takes a lot more effort to collect the data needed for the crossing LTS. But in this smaller area, you're able to see this. This is the Highway 190 or Capitol Drive. A number of these crossings are PLTS 4. the multi-lane 30-mile-an-hour crossings. In some cases, there's a refuge island. In other cases, there's not. When you look at the neighborhood streets, some narrow 2-lane residential streets with low traffic volumes, crossing those at the heart of an intersection, that is PLTS 1. Something that I should mention about practical application of the crossing tool is that each of these intersections here has 4 crossings to it, or 3, depending on whether it's a T intersection or not. The PLTS that is assigned to the intersection at the intersection level is the most stressful crosswalk of all 4 or all 3 that are there. So you may actually have relatively low stress experience walking along Capitol Drive and then crossing the minor streets that tee into it, but crossing Capitol Drive itself is a very stressful experience. And so the intersection got rated as a PLTS 4. Another example, looking at specifically segment PLTS, we were able to look at a before and after situation in Egg Harbor, Wisconsin. In this corridor, one of the county highways, they added a sidewalk along the south side of the roadway. And so it went from this very narrow shoulder that people scooted along to now a walkable sidewalk. In looking up the tables there, this was PLTS 4 in the previous configuration, and now with the new sidewalk, it's PLTS 3. One thing that could potentially be done in the future is, this is a 30-foot curb-to-curb cross-section. If this was striped with 2 travel lanes and then 2 5-foot bike lanes on either side, that 5-foot bike lane would be counted as the buffer area between the moving travel lane and the sidewalk. And that would allow the PLTS to go down to 2. So that's something that is also accounted for. They could also put in a grassy buffer or planters along there too, to be counted as a buffer. Because we're simplifying this method, we don't make a distinction between different types of buffers, even though having planters or trees might be a different experience than walking along a roadway with just a grassy buffer or just a painted bike lane. But we're trying to simplify the process so that it can be relatively easy to apply. Another example from the city of Milwaukee. They've just completed a Van Buren Street transformation project. This is the conceptual drawing of it prior to actual construction. Before it was reconstructed, Van Buren Street was a 4-lane undivided arterial street. It did have bike lanes on either side, but it was not as pleasant for pedestrians, especially to cross. And so this new configuration provided a 2-way cycle track on the east side of the street, provided some refuge islands for crossing, as well as in-lane bus boarding islands, and reduced the number of lanes from 4 down to 3 at each crossing. So based on that, we were able to assess the crossings before and after this project. And what had previously been mostly a PLTS 4 or PLTS 3, all the crossings under the new design are PLTS 2. So we can see that improvement. And as somebody who goes across this on foot fairly often, I definitely feel less stressful going across Van Buren Street. Now, there's a number of considerations that I've been alluding to throughout, but are really important to be aware of. Obviously, one of the most important is that pedestrian LTS is necessarily simple. We want a tool that can be easily used. Now, you don't need to have a special spreadsheet formula, even though we could potentially enter this into a spreadsheet tool at some point. You can just go to a lookup table and see what the PLTS is. But PLTS is only one representation of the experience, and how we should be planning for pedestrians. It doesn't account for sidewalk heaving and other surface disruptions that may make a sidewalk inaccessible, for example. It also doesn't account for a number of other aspects of what's required for ADA. We wanted to include curb ramps, but you should complement the PLTS with an ADA accessibility assessment. In addition, it's important to do crash analysis, assess pedestrian demand. Locations that have more pedestrians crossing, for example, may be a higher priority than other locations that have fewer pedestrians crossing or walking along the street, even if they have the same pedestrian LTS. Our tool doesn't account for the social environment or the economic conditions of an area. That's also important to pedestrians and their experience and feeling comfortable in an area. So that's something else that should be done that isn't captured by this tool. And then, of course, public engagement, understanding what community members are looking for and ultimately see as barriers right now to their experience while walking or being pedestrians in a corridor. Always critical to the process. To be more explicit about some of the characteristics that we don't include, pedestrian volumes. We know from the literature that people feel more comfortable if they're around other people who are walking across the street or along a corridor. That's not part of this analysis. Some of the previous PLTS tools had tried to account for pedestrian volumes or the adjacent land use, but we wanted to focus really just on the roadway corridor features themselves. We don't account for differences in signal timing, right turn on red restrictions, turning radii. All these are important to pedestrian safety. We know that restricting right turn on red can lead to potentially half as many pedestrian crashes in a community if they have that implemented community-wide. Turning radii are very important for reducing the risk of a turning crash. The experience aesthetically is also important, but we don't account for this. Landscaping, various conditions of facilities. Is there graffiti, for example? What about noise from traffic? We don't account for that, even though indirectly higher traffic volume would probably be associated with more noise. But that's not measured as a part of our PLTS tool, even though this is important to the pedestrian experience. We're really focusing on the most critical factors that would be associated with perceptions of traffic risk as a pedestrian. One that I think is really important to consider for the future and is a critical risk factor is roadway lighting and darkness. Those conditions lead to higher risk for pedestrians at night. And if we have walkways and crossings that are better lit, we're likely to have a more comfortable and less stressful pedestrian experience. Thinking about how to assess this is very challenging. Just saying that there's a light post that has some lighting in an intersection is one thing, but if it's really does a good job of lighting up the crosswalk and the crossing area, or the curb area where some pedestrian may be ready to enter the crosswalk, those pedestrian level lighting features are more important than just having a single light post. So figuring out how to assess that and bringing it into this method is something that we'd love to do in the future, but we don't have in the tool yet. And then this also brings up another key point about pedestrian LTS. Right now, we're mainly targeting it to assess what are conditions like for pedestrians crossing during a peak period time during the day. In reality, pedestrian LTS actually changes throughout the day and throughout the week, depending on how much traffic there is and what the lighting conditions are. The true experience of a pedestrian feeling stressed around traffic does change, but we're aiming for those particular times where the highest activities are occurring right now. It could be that at some point in the future, we have a daytime PLTS and then a nighttime PLTS. and that would be interesting to assess. So there's a few next steps that we are working on now in year 2 of our PLTS work for the center. We want to apply the tool in San Diego, Albuquerque, and Milwaukee. Nick has some places there in Albuquerque that he wants to try it out on. We're working with Safe Streets Research, Rebecca Sanders, and her team have done some work in San Diego already to use a network version of their version of a PLTS. And so there may be some lessons that we can take from that and bring that into the year 2 PLTS evaluation. We want to then go do some validation and find out how well the tool actually reflects people's perceived ratings through surveys and interviews. I'll talk about that just for a little bit more on the next slide. And then ultimately refine the tool. Importantly, we want to ask, can this tool show a relationship with pedestrian crash risk and be used as some level of a network screening analysis to find some of the locations that may have the highest underlying pedestrian crash risk, especially for roadway crossings. So as we move forward, I'd love to hear if anybody has ideas about the specifics of doing this, but we're going to be embarking on some practitioners, especially in those case study communities, looking at maps and tables and giving us their assessment of what they think works well, what could be improved. We want to do some intercept surveys, as well as have some online surveys for people to assess what they think roadway segments and roadway crossings, how comfortable and stressful they are based on certain conditions. And we'd like to do that both within people's neighborhoods. We may intercept a number of people going to transit stations in San Diego. Bruce Appleyard and his team is looking at that. And then we may also have an online survey that includes some pictures and descriptions of these types of locations, so we can get people's raw ratings of what their traffic PLTS experience is. So that is my overview of the PLTS. You can find it online on the CPBS website, but I open for any questions that you have, either for Nick from his first presentation or mine right now.
Hey, Bob, we've got a few questions in the Q&A box, so I'll just go
Sure.
through and pick a few for you.
Yep.
This is from Elizabeth. She's asking, how does parking or lack of parking affect the level of traffic stress with relation to the curb extension? For example, curb extensions are generally not applicable if there is no parking lane.
That's right. So in the cases where curb extensions are, they're going to be streets with on-street parking. And so that wouldn't directly affect the pedestrian crossing LTS, but the on-street parking does affect the pedestrian segment LTS in terms of providing a buffer between where the people are traveling as pedestrians and the moving traffic. I think it's actually an interesting suggestion I want to think about a little bit more too, because as you have if you don't have a curb extension but do have on-street parking, there may be limited visibility to a crosswalk depending on how close the cars parked to it. So that's something that we may want to consider for future.
All right, we've got another question from Salish. Is LTS only about the perceived safety or also the accessibility as far as reaching different opportunities, such as jobs or groceries and so on? If yes, is there any effort in defining how LTS is related to increased travel time for bicyclists or pedestrians?
I'll start with the pedestrian LTS, and then Nick, maybe you can add on the bicycle side. But on the pedestrian side, we've tried to focus it to keep it simple, just on the traffic risk situation and people's comfort around motor vehicles. I was alluding to the idea that if there's more pedestrian activity, people are likely to feel a little bit more comfortable around traffic, and that is associated with demand. But we don't build the land use or demand side into our PLTS method, and we'd recommend complementing the PLTS evaluation with a demand analysis for pedestrians.
Yeah, I'd echo what Bob said. LTS is really fundamentally about safety perceptions. It's a tool to get at that, and then how the city uses the tool, where they prioritize their networks in terms of access to different land uses. That's really up to the city. But yeah, LTS is kind of the tool for safety perceptions, and then applying it to make sure accessibility to schools, to whatever you're focused on. That's kind of up to each individual city.
All right, we've got another question from Michael about LTS in rural areas. He says the major drawback with traditional LTS as applied to rural towns is that there is little range available to distinguish one road from another, e.g. most streets are 25 to 30 miles per hour, most streets are 2-lane, etc. You end up with almost every street labeled as a 2 or 3. This has led to a number of LTS variants that are more applicable to the reduced range of these characteristics. Is there any plans to account for this phenomenon?
I think that what you described there is one of the limitations of the pedestrian level of service in the highway capacity manual. And what we're hoping in our tables is that you will see more variation across communities. In particular, I think that the main highways that go through small towns are going to show up with a high level of traffic stress. Once you get into some of the residential back streets in small towns, you're in a PLTS 1 or 2 situation in most cases. The other thing that I think that our tables will help support is the idea of having a sidewalk, adding sidewalks at least on one side of the roadway, hopefully on both in many locations, because that's going to be a clear increase in the LTS.
And for the bicyclists, I'm hoping that the focus on critical crossings narrows down what we're concerned with, because we'll probably get a lot of 2s and 3s, but we're really just looking for those LTS 3 crossings on an LTS 1 corridor. So hopefully that helps us narrow down priority intersections.
I should add one other thing related to that. That was a really good question. And our thresholds for the traffic volumes. So our daily traffic volume thresholds were 2,500 and 7,500, which are really pretty low if you consider some of the city traffic volumes that you have, but they may be well suited for a number of the smaller communities as well, differentiating between, well, once you get over 2,500 vehicles per day, you're kind of into another category. And when you get over 7,500, then you're starting to get into sort of steadier traffic throughout the day. And so that'll be good to for us to continue to watch. Are these good thresholds that sort of are useful both in urban and in rural areas?
All right, we had a similar question from a couple of different people for both types of LTS. Are the vehicle types on the road a consideration, like as far as like a route with heavy semi-truck traffic versus another route where all the other characteristics are the same?
We don't have that included in our PLTS, though that has been a factor in previous literature, and we do know that heavy trucks do create more stress, but for simplicity's sake, we don't have that included, at least at this point. Nick, I don't know on the bike side.
No, we don't have that either. We're still trying to figure out which variables to include, which not, but at this point, we don't account for that.
And then we had a question from Heather asking if she says in her county most of the crosswalks are not marked. Could that be included in LTS even if it's not marked?
I don't know if I did a great job of making that distinction, but we do have marked and unmarked crosswalks. They're different columns in those crossing tables. So we are trying to account for their presence having some potential effect on pedestrian comfort. We always do need to be aware of the literature in this case where the marked crosswalk alone may not be a sufficient treatment to really create a safer environment. And so that's why we were giving lower traffic stress levels when we add the pedestrian crossing refuge, adding curb extensions, some of those other facilities too. But yes, we do have it separated out.
All right, we got another crosswalk question from Steve. He's asking, have you looked at mid-block crossings, especially for long blocks?
Great question. Nick has brought this up on our research team. So if you have a challenge to get to a signalized intersection where you may feel more comfortable crossing, that may create a situation where you take more of a chance to cross in the middle of a block where there isn't a crosswalk. And so that's kind of how I see that being an issue. We haven't accounted for that yet in our method, but I think it's a great thing to be continuing to look at. That point, I think it's important to emphasize, we are looking at crosswalks from the perspective of any place where somebody might cross that could be evaluated using this method. It doesn't have to be at an intersection. It could be at a marked mid-block crossing, or it could just be a location in the middle of a block that a lot of people may want to try to cross. And so an agency can then assess what that crossing experience would be like in the PLTS rating scale.
All right, looks like we got time for about one, maybe two more. Joseph asks for pedestrian stress and considering right turning vehicle conflicts at intersections or attributes like turn radii or presence of slip lanes considered.
So no, we have not considered that yet, and that may be a version 2 type of addition. As Nick is getting to those sorts of things for the BLTS, we may want to eventually add those in the future, but it's not included in the current version yet.
All right, we'll get in one more quick question from Heather. Does the accessible curbs mean meeting PROAG or some other standard?
It would mean meeting PROAG, yes.
All right. Well, we got 2 minutes left if you guys want to close it out.
All right, well, Nick, I'll let you finish it, but thank you for all the excellent questions. As I mentioned as we were presenting, if you want to try out the PLTS tables in your own community in a corridor, please let us know what the experience is like and if you have any advice. We are working over this whole entire next year on doing the validation process and then refining this method, so we'd appreciate it. So thanks.
And thanks everybody for being here. Yeah, definitely reach out to myself or Bob or any of our research team. Please engage with us. We also have our next webinar coming up. I don't see it on our website quite yet, but it's in December. So keep an eye out for that as well. Please follow us on LinkedIn. We'll be posting there. But yeah, thank you for all the input. Sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but we'll try to follow up. And yeah, thank you everybody for your time and input.